come together to celebrate the 50th wedding anniversary of Mary Aline and Frank O'Donnell. Mary Aline and her sister Dorothy Arnoldy are the daughters of Caroline Margaret Brown. Caroline was born in Kingman County, Kansas, the sixth child of Will V. Provo and Caroline Hopkins Provo, and she's here with her daughters to speak about her experiences.
Well, first off, I want you to know that I consider myself a pioneer lady. I grew up on the prairie of Oklahoma. Now, some people may think that's a hard life, but it was a beautiful life. Everybody was in the same boat. Nobody had money, so we helped one another. And it was a happy time for all of us. And it was joining opening of the Oklahoma Strip. They called it when I was a girl, but now they're more sophisticated. It is the Cherokee Land Run, and that happened in 1893, September the 16th. And I was born in 1894 in February, and I was too young to leave, my father thought, so he wasn't in the opening. He didn't go in the run, but my grandfather did. My grandfather rode a horse, and he made the run and staked a claim. And the claim is still in the family. It's a lovely homestead. It first went to the grandchildren, and my brother brought out the heirs, and then he farmed it till he passed away 2 years ago, and his son fell heir to it. So I think it'll always be in the family. And we have great respect for that old homestead, and for my grandfather, who had the courage to stay all night on the opening line, which I understand was miles long, waiting for the signal to start the run. And I believe they fired I thought a cannon, but I guess it was a gun. And they were all off. Some people had the lumber wagon, all their family possessions, children and all. Others were on foot, and some rode in the carriage. Not very many rode in the carriage, but my grandfather went by horse. And a lot of people went ahead of time and looked all around and practically staked their claim. But they had to be cleared or they were prosecuted. And they were called Sooners. And that's why that's called the Sooner State. And the people from Oklahoma were called Sooners for a good many years. But a lot of people practically had their stake up, ready to, but if somebody else beat you there, you was out of luck. But water was very important, and everybody was trying to settle where there was a creek, a river, or prospects of a good well. And my grandfather hit it rich, had a good well, and that would be the first thing they put out. And they lived in a dugout, called a dugout, in the bank of a creek until they could get a better dugout built. And they went up on a hill like where they'd made a well, and they had a dugout, was really nice. It even had a window in it. And they lived in that until they hauled their logs and built their log house. And they lived in that till the rest of their lives. And my brother lived in it and raised part of his family there. But it was a nice log house.
I think we have a picture of the log house.
Yes, we do.
Yes.
And my grandparents. And that was, I probably was about 4 years old when that was taken. But they went to work right away on the log house. Later, they built 2 nice rooms here, and was quite modern. But that windmill is there yet today, pumping water, supplying the stock, and they tore the log house down and moved a nice country house on it. And it's there, and it's in good condition. They keep it up real good.
Well, then now how did your father get into Oklahoma?
Well, when the family became a little more stable, he went down and staked a claim on the Canadian River. He thought that would be good country to raise corn and have water. So then he went back to Kansas to bring the family, which was, I was 6 weeks old, and the youngest of 6 children. And
Who were those children now, Mother?
Well, my brother Ward was 10 years older than I, and my brother Jim was 1 year younger than he, and Clarence and Merle was 15 months older than I, and myself. That
And Grace.
Grace was just older than Merle. I forgot. Yes. So
So there was Ward and Jim,
Clarence.
then Grace,
Yes.
Merle, and you were 6 weeks old.
Right.
And the whole family went?
The whole family went in the covered wagon, took a tent to pitch at night, and we had a dozen chickens, a cow, a team and a wagon, and $40 in his pocket. That was his stake to go down to his claim and move his family.
Now, he was going from where? Kansas?
He's going from, I believe it was,
Kingman.
let's see, it was
Kingman County?
Kingman County, and Norwich was the name of the closest town. And it took us about 3 days, I think, to get down to Grandpa Hopkins' place, and we camped overnight and then went on to our homestead. When we got there, it was a rainy season, and the river was up and everything was underwater. He couldn't find his stake. He couldn't find his home. So we stayed overnight. The men fished the next day, and then the next morning we started back to Kansas. We intended to go back to Kansas, but instead we stopped at my grandfather's overnight, and a neighbor that knew my father in Kansas came over and told him. He said, if you want a homestead, I can tell you where you can get it. This gentleman, Mr. Ayers, homesick, he wants to go home. He wants to sell what he has. So my father went to see him, and he bought the homestead, I believe, for $25. And he paid $5 down. That's all he could spare out of his legacy. So he said, that's fine. He said, I'll pay you later. Well, I think it was 30 years before he finished the payment. But he accidentally located the man, introduced himself, and he says, I want to pay you the rest of the money. And he didn't even recognize him. But that's the way we got our homestead. And that wasn't very expensive.
How far was that from Grandpa Hopkins?
2 miles.
Just 2 miles. That was very convenient.
They had the northeast quarter, and we were across the road in the south-northwest corner of the next quarter. Mm-hmm. And if we walked across the prairie, which we did, it wasn't 2 miles even. Mm-hmm. But if you went around, it was 2 miles.
So what did you do? Pitch your tent there to live in for a while?
Pitched our tent for a short time, but my father had to go back to Kansas because he had a little wheat harvest and a little crop of corn. So I haven't figured out whether we started the sod house before we went back to Kansas, but he had seen a header in Kansas that really caught his eye.
Is this the picture of it, Mother?
That's the header.
That's the equipment that they had.
That's the 14-foot wheat header, which was the only one of its kind in the country. And I'm real proud of his foresight. And to look forward, he went back to Kansas and he bought that header. And he harvested wheat that summer all over the wheat fields in Kansas. And that
was to make a little dough.
Harvest his own crop, and he made money. And we lived in a tent, and my mother cooked for all the harvest hands, which was about 10, besides her own family. And we lived in a tent, moved around.
How could she do that with all these little kids?
Oh, one of my aunts said Carrie could keep house with a skillet and a dish rag. She had so much force and ambition and planning, she could just fall into line and do anything. But she did it, and I was just the baby, and the harvest hands would take care of me while she put the food out, which would be a picnic tablecloth, and they'd sit around that and eat. And then they'd ready to go back to the field. And it took 6 horses to push that header. And a lot of times they'd change horses at noon, and they'd run just as late as they could in the evening if the wheat was dry.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Let me see that picture again. The horses were behind the thing, pushing.
They pushed.
And normally you think of them pulling
Yes.
equipment, don't you?
But
But
you
here
see,
they are behind.
Here's your canvas elevator that elevated your wheat up into the header barge.
Yeah, let it fall into
And there
it.
was a sickle that run across here that cut the wheat, and he guided it. He guided it with his knees and drove his 6 horses and kept that lined up so they didn't lose the wheat that fell in the header barge. One header barge you pull up, the straw would fall in it, and another one come right under it. he'd haul it over there and stack it, and they so on all day. There was 3 header barges.
Isn't that interesting?
It was really very interesting. And he drove that header and cut wheat as long as he stayed on the farm until the combines come in. And it was so outdated that he made a lot of parts when he needed repair. He couldn't get the repairs. And always amending the canvas. He'd start in weeks before harvest because he cut wheat for all the neighbors. Nobody had a header. And they'd come and have him cut their wheat. And he'd harvest all summer and keep that header running. A lot of times he'd have to send one person to Alva, which was 14 miles, but it had a railroad, had repairs, and at night, and by the next morning, they'd be back with the repairs and they'd go again. Because the secret of the game is not to quit. Every minute counts, because if comes a hailstorm, a rainstorm, it can harvest for you in an hour's time. So that was their income for the entire year.
But he did this the summer before you came back to Oklahoma
Yes.
to live.
He cut his
Yes.
wheat, harvested his crop, and then moved us all back to Oklahoma to stay.
So then he could build something for
Sod
you to live
house,
in.
a sod house, which was big. We had a story and a half, and 2 big rooms, and 1 big room upstairs. And finally, he put a nice shingle roof on it because the other roof leaked. And if you've ever seen an adobe house, you'll know a sod house is a great deal like adobe. Big, deep walls, warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And we lived in that, I would say, about 5 or 6 years. Then
If I remember correctly, the boys slept upstairs,
they slept up in, they called it the attic, but they liked it.
but they actually could have an attic in a sod house.
Yes, only one I know of. He was preparing for room for sleeping quarters. So
You
we
told
lived-
us about the windows. Did they have windows in those sod houses?
Oh yes, we had windows in the north, in the south, and in the west, and they're real deep windows.
And they had panes of glass.
Oh yes, And my mother sat in that window and held me there all night one night to keep me dry because the roof was leaking, and I was the baby, and that was important for me not to get sick and take a cold. So she sat in that window all night to keep me from getting leaked on, and that's the reason we had to have a shingle roof. So then my dad decided it was time to have a frame house. So he built a 4-roomed house, a real upstairs with an attic and a downstairs. And the neighbors all come in and helped lift that shingle roof off of the sod house onto the frame house.
How could they do that?
Well, there is a picture in existence, and I wish I had it. I'm going to have a copy, but they had great long 2x4s. And they'd put them way back like this to start it. And my father would give a signal. I can hear that signal to this day. And when he'd give a signal, they'd all push as far as their sticks would go, and then they'd rest and get a new hold back here on the 2x4. I think there was 30 neighbors came in to help. And they raised that roof up
On all sides of it. I can see how that would be.
Yes, and they raised that roof in one afternoon, probably in just a couple of hours. And of course, you know, that was really nice to have a frame house and room for all of us.
Right.
And I think by then there was about 8 children.
Who were the ones that we know about the 6 down to you? Then who was next
After
you? Wilma?
Wilma, then Imogene, then George, and Dora.
And that's probably about all that you had while you still had the smaller frame house.
Yes, about 19, we had the house finished, 8 rooms, when Nora was a baby. But you know, that picture tells a story.
Let's look at that picture.
That picture is really gives me great pride because we went from a tent, a sod house, into this lineup, I would say, in about I was probably 12, 13 years old when that house was complete.
When it was expanded into a big house.
8 rooms.
8 rooms.
And I tell you, it was a beautiful home. I'm proud of it. And
this is really a tall windmill.
Yes. I think my father, with a little help, built that wooden tower. And this artist that painted this picture had been looking for a wooden windmill tower. They're all iron now. And when he saw this picture, he says, "There's my wooden windmill tower." And when we first built it, it was right there, and the side house was right there. And then when we built a frame house, it was so tall that it affected the windmill. So they had to extend the tower. And I never got up on that windmill. It scared me to death when I saw my father get up there to oil it. But he had to every so often. But we could go out on this top deck and see for miles there in Oklahoma. We could, on certain times, we could see the tower in Alva, 14 miles away. The air, we had great, what do you call it, those mirrors?
Mirages?
Mirages. Yeah, about 2 miles away would like you sitting in your front yard. I've never seen one like they had in Oklahoma. And a time like that, we could go up on that deck and see 14 miles away, see that water tower in Alva. It's very interesting.
Very interesting.
But
And there's the barn, and they had lots of. And what's this little building back here? Is that the milk house?
Yes.
It's right back at
that
the
was
windmill.
That was a log house, and it was a lifesaver on the farm. My father built we called it a milk trough. It was almost as long as this couch, about this wide and yay deep, and he fixed it so the windmill pumped the fresh water right into that, we called it the milk tank. And it went from there then into the horse trough. So we never was allowed to spill anything into that milk tank. And we had brick in there to set our big crocks on. We had to set milk in there, sometimes 2 gallon, and sometimes one of those flat, or 1 gallon. So we'd adjust the size to our bricks. And he had a lid that was lined with cheesecloth, and we'd lay that lid back. And then when we was through getting our supplies, we'd lay it back over the milk. We had to do that to keep it all clean. But that well, third well he put down, pumped the water for everything, day and night. I never knew the well to go dry.
I guess people had to hand dig their wells. They didn't have anything to drill with.
That well was across about like that and bricked up, had a brick lining.
You mean they had to get down in there themselves and shovel the dirt out, I suppose, and pull it up on a...
They had a big windlass, they called it. It stationed across the well and a handle on it, and one man had to operate that handle, and a big strong rope to let him down in a bucket and his equipment. And then the next guy, there'd be 2 or 3 working at it, go down there, and that's the way they got the dirt up. They'd fill that big bucket, it was pretty good size, with dirt, and they'd give a whistle, and up would come the dirt, and they'd empty it out. Wasn't that something?
Yeah, it was.
No, they never drilled the well.
And then they brick it up after they reached the water.
Yes, when they knew they had water, then they'd brick it up. And it was really nice and clean. And then we put a great big platform around it, wooden, so it'd be safe. And then a pump. But it wasn't too long till we had the windmill. And that windmill run day and night in summertime. And supplied 2 farms, stock and all, with water. And the thrash machines, the old engines with the steam, they had to have water all the time. Had a water tank hauling water. They'd come there and get their supply. And if the wind wasn't blowing, somebody had to stay there and pump water for the water monkey, we called him. But I tell you, there's so much progress since I first can remember until now. It's just absolutely fascinating when you think of it. You think of the only way of motivation was wagon and team, when I can first remember.
Yeah.
And then, if you're lucky, you had a good riding horse. And my father always had a riding horse that you could get on horseback, go get your mail, and get a few groceries. And then years later, we had a spring wagon, and that was a lightweight, like a lumber wagon, only very light. But we had room for 2 spring seats, and back here, 3 or 4 children could sit if they wanted to.
Is that how you loaded up the whole family? And went
No,
places?
we went in the lumber wagon.
You went in the lumber wagon?
Oh, yes, the spring wagon didn't come for a long time.
And is this the way you went to church?
Oh, yes, yes. We went to church. We could have the sideboards on, 2 spring seats, but usually mother and father and a couple of children sit in the front seat. And the children, we'd all arrange ourselves in the back and have a picnic. We just cut up and play around back there in that wagon. If it was cold, we had lots of covers to wrap up in and keep us warm. And then later, we had the spring wagon. But I don't ever remember my older brothers going in the wagon with us. They had their riding horses for the time I can remember. They'd ride along with us, because he wasn't very old, but they'd ride horseback. And then soon there was 3 of them. And then I can remember when Merle had his riding horse. So that took the load off the wagon.
Yes.
Then,
Did they? How did they organize the church and the school in the pioneer days when you first got there? How did they get started with all that?
well, they knew they was going to have a school. And my brothers, 3 of them, went to the first school in the room of a neighbor's house. They didn't have them. Then my grandfather donated off of his land, I think something like 5 or 10 acres, whatever they needed, to be used for a schoolhouse as long as it was needed for the school. And that was a good many years. So most of that was volunteer work. They went to work and built a schoolhouse. And that was a schoolhouse for a long, long time.
Was it sort of like a one-room schoolhouse?
It was a 1 room and 1 teacher, and she taught all 8th grades. And a lot of times she had students older than she was, but they could help her.
Pretty young teachers then.
Oh yes, they just graduated from the 8th grade, went to teachers college 6 weeks in the summer. If they could pass the test, they was a teacher. And so that's the way they got started to teach us.
So sometimes they might be only about 16.
Oh, a lot of times, yes. That was probably average, 16, 17.
Sometimes you had a man school teacher, though, too, didn't you?
Oh, yes, yeah. And our little school got the name being tough, so they hired a man to handle those big boys and those mean kids, and he come in there with the idea that he had to whip everybody. The first 3 days, he whipped 3 children, and that scared me to death. They had to take me out of school. I was scared to death of it.
Was that your first year?
Yes. And
First year of school?
I was sick. He made me sick.
I believe he must have.
Oh, he just wrecked me. So they just had to take me out of school for another year. But he was mean. He got the idea that they wasn't, but they'd pull tricks on those little young teachers, and they was too old to be going to school anyway. There was nothing else to do. After the crop was planted, they all went to school.
I guess they didn't go to school 9 months like our schools are.
Oh, listen, they voted on how many months they'd have, and the people that needed their kids home to work would want 3 months of school. They finally got it up to 4, then finally 6. We had 6 months of school, and that was pretty well into spring. And the boys were needed on the farm. Well, they took them out of school, really, to help the work. So they tried to adjust, but they never did have 9 months in the country that I know of. It might have been after I grew up, moved away, that they did, but it was a short education, and they'd have to get their homework with the old coil lamp together after all the chores was done. And my folks milked 10, 12 cows, and that's what we called the chores. And we always had that all done up. Then we could have dinner in the evening by the lamplight, and we'd gather around the big kitchen table. But we always had popcorn or apples and homework. And when that was all done, we could have a little table game.
It must have been quite a chore to cook for such a large family.
Well, you can imagine it was, growing boys. But my mother was an organizer. As soon as we could help, we were all taught to help with the work. I used to stand on a chair and wash dishes. I wanted to help. And we all had our chores cut out for us. Somebody could set the table, and 2 or 3 others could wash the dishes. And when the kitchen work was done, we'd go out to play. And then we had to come in and help fix the lunch, set the table for that many people. We had a great, big, huge table that my father had built. And then he had benches. One of my nieces will always remember that big table and those benches. But he had made these big, long benches back of the table. You couldn't get that many chairs hardly with kids sitting in around that big table. But we had those benches, and they were really neat. And then finally we had a really nice dining room table. And we could set 2 tables in that kitchen when we...
I remember that kitchen was very, very large.
Yeah. Well, there was actually 3 rooms above it. You can imagine how large it was. And then a pantry off of that. So
what did you fix mostly for meals? What kinds of foods did you fix?
it wasn't what are we going to have, it's what have we got. We raised food, canned food, and my folks used to buy vegetables by the crate. Canned tomatoes, canned corn, and dried fruits by the pound, by the sack, 10 pounds, to last us all winter, because it was 14 miles to get those things, and it was a lot of times very cold, very stormy, and you couldn't get there. So they laid in a big supply of potatoes in the cellar, and it wasn't unusual for us to can 300 quarts of fruit or 4. And we'd have to buy that from various places where they could raise fruit.
Didn't you tell us one time about going up to Kansas to get apples?
Oh yes, they always, in the fall, they went up to Sharon, Kansas. That was considered apple country, and brought back a big, full lumber wagon load. And we planned on keeping all that we would need. We'd put them down in the fruit cellar. And my father would sell to the neighbors. If they wanted 5 bushel, 2 bushel, whatever they wanted, he'd sell out. And it wasn't any trick to sell it.
Tell us about that trip you made for Imogene.
Well, I was about 5 years old, and she was sick, and just seemed like
She was the baby.
couldn't get a handle on it. And I don't know, I guess the folks thought if they went back to Kansas, they'd find a good doctor. Doctors were hard to come by. They didn't like living out there in the sticks, as it was called, and it would be 12 or 14 miles horseback to get a doctor. And we usually could make it if it was serious, but the medicine didn't do her any good.
How old was she?
She was a year old.
She was a year old.
It was her second summer. And they decided to hitch up the team and wagon and load up the kids and take off for Kansas, up there where they had good doctors. So we went on tour and visited all the relatives, went back through the country where my folks had lived when they were young.
In a wagon?
In a wagon and a team. And every night we'd camp, and my father would cook out on the campfire. He could make the best fried potatoes on that campfire you ever ate, and coffee, and feed us kids, bed us down, and get ready to start out the next day. You couldn't go very many miles. You can't trot a team. You have to walk them when they're hitched to a lumber wagon and a load.
People.
Yes. And they didn't all go, just Grace and Merle and Wilma and myself and Imogene. But
The big boys stayed home to work.
they stayed home to care of the work. And I think Grandpa and Grandma Hopkins stayed with them to help. So that was quite an adventure, and I just remember it very well. And we were gone from September, I forget the date, until November. And we come home, it's getting pretty close to Thanksgiving. So we had a big homecoming up with Grandpa and Grandma Hopkins. Probably had turkey and all the trimming, but we had a good time. And when we come back, nobody knew my little sister. She had big rosy cheeks and was a picture of health, and they couldn't believe it. And we visited, every place we visited, they had apple orchards. And they didn't want her to eat apples. They thought it'd just kill her. Every time they looked at her, she had an apple. And then later they decided the apples was good for her, and that made her well, because they never did take her to a doctor.
She got well on her own.
She got well on natural food. Oh, she was really the picture of health, and nobody knew her. They couldn't believe it.
Isn't that wonderful?
So we've always, it's been a joke that we went on tour for Imogene's health.
Yeah. I
It
think that's neat.
was quite a trip, really.
You know, the boys, it seemed like, it started very young, helping in the fields and all of that.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
How old were they when they got out there?
Well, by the time they were taught to drive a horse. Now, my little brother, George, you've seen pictures of him. I don't think he was over 8 years old when he could drive a team in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And they started real young helping with the chores and all the outside work. So that left Mother and the girls to take care of the house. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we had help from my father. Every wash day we had help. Either one of my brothers or my father would stay. We didn't have electric wash machine, you know.
Yeah.
They were hand turned, and we run the clothes through a wringer, and so that's what the men did. They would do the hard work, and we would boss it. But we had good help. My father never neglected either stay at the house and help or have some of the boys help. And you know, when you read his ledger, he spent a lot of time at the house.
I think this is a wonderful ledger. Tell us a little bit about it. And that's why we know so much detail, right?
Yes, every day he wrote a little in his ledger about the weather and what he had done. If anybody was sick or somebody come to see us, all that was written on that line.
Right.
And it tells a lot of things and gives dates.
Mm-hmm.
It's been
Tells
worth
prices
to us.
and how much
Yes.
something cost or
Yes.
how much he was paid for something.
Yes, and that book is older than I am, and it's getting very fragile.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's a lot of recordings in that we have been grateful for.
Yes,
And a
this one
man-
starts in January of 1893.
Yes,
That was the year before you were born.
yes.
Uh-huh. And it must go to 1895 anyway.
Well, there's many books. I think I have 3, and some of the rest of the family. But the later ones were not nearly as interesting as this.
This is the one that records your birth
Yes,
and
Right.
all of that, which is so interesting.
yes. And there's older books, but I think Don has that. But he says, how in the world could grandfather do so many things and go so many places the same day? Well, that's a question, because he moved all the time and he moved fast, and he really had a vision way ahead, just like buying that 14-foot header. That earned him a good income every year. But, you know, it was such a big header and cut so much wheat at one time. And that was so important. And a lot of the farmers couldn't even afford any kind of a convenience to cut the crop. So they'd help. They'd furnish a team for the header barge and 2 men to work in the header barge.
In return, he'd do their crop.
He'd do their crop. And that's the way they got along.
What about those ponies that he used to deal in? Tell us about those.
Well, you read in the book, in that Caddie book, where he was a good trader. But the interesting thing was, the Indians come by driving a big herd of horses. They was wild horses. They wanted to sell them for money, and he bought them. He could see that he had a chance of breaking them to ride, to work, and he broke them for everything. And that was one of the most interesting times in our life. We had a man and his wife and a young boy working for us. And this young boy was a bronco buster, he called him. Well, that just fit the pattern. So we had this barn built back in the like a dugout.
And the bank of a creek.
A bank of a, well, you know, they had these big things they call scrapers. They'd hitch a team to it and had handles. One man would drive the horse, and they'd scrape out dirt until they had it deep enough that the walls of that barn was dirt on two sides and one end. And it was up, I say 2 foot off the ground, finally, the roof. And 3 of us, Burl and Grace and I, enjoyed our pastime. We'd crawl up on that barn, had a straw roof, and we'd dig holes so we could lay up there and watch them saddle up those horses. And it was, that way we were safe. You wasn't safe out in the yard, any place around, because you couldn't get away from them fast enough. And that old cowboy, he'd pet them and pat them, and they had these check reins on them, hitched around a big post. And when he'd get the saddle on, finally, it took a while, and the bridle, then he'd give the signal, and they'd loosen the reins and the ropes, and the way he'd go. And he had his spurs, and you know when you ride a bronco, if you can keep his head up, he can't buck. But that's the trick. Some of them would try to land the whip on him and keep him running so he couldn't get his head down. But sometimes he got his head down, and I can remember he'd knock the wind out of that that rider every time he come down on all 4 feet. It was amazing, but I don't ever remember him getting thrown off. But they broke every one of those horses to ride and drive and work, and some of them made beautiful riding horses, and drive to the buggy and sold them. He'd sell them. People wanted to buy them. So
I think it's so interesting that he did so many things.
It sounds like he did just almost everything.
Well, that's I think proves it when you think it took about, I would say, only 12 years to go from a sod house to that complete farm. And
That's not bad.
No, it isn't. When you had, by then, he had 12 children, but we were not, the older ones had already some married and left home. But there was that winter, the one winter, when our mother passed away, practically all of them were home. Grace,
I think we have a picture, don't we, of the family? No?
we have a picture of when we had 10 children.
Right. This is the one?
Yes, that's the one. Diane was the baby.
Uh-huh.
And Jim was getting ready to go to Kansas to get a job. And the folks figured we're going to start scattering. So they wanted a family group. And then after that, there was 2 more children.
Right.
But
So this is Jim.
That's Jim.
And that's Clarence and Warb.
Warb. And Grace.
This must be Uncle Merle.
Yes. And I'm 10.
There you are.
10. Emma Jean.
Emma Jean.
And
Wilma sitting here.
Yeah.
And
George.
George. I would have thought that was a little girl. He's wearing a dress.
Well, boys wore dresses. See, they're made with a little belt. They called them little boys' dresses.
Yes.
And
the baby was?
Diane.
Diane.
Wasn't she a pretty little thing?
Yes.
She was a beautiful little doll. But
I see that Imogene is wearing a ribbon, and she must have had an award. So is Wilma.
yes, they got
won
those from their Sunday school teacher for attending so many Sundays, having their lesson, and not missing a day.
Oh, how neat.
I don't know
Where's
why.
yours?
No, I'm afraid I didn't own one. I went, though. I went to Sunday school every Sunday.
The whole family, probably.
Yes, that was our main weekly outing. We wouldn't miss Sunday school, come rain or shine.
That was your social outlet.
It was. We organized our parties and our, they had literary at the schoolhouse, and that took a lot of practice. They put on plays, and grown-ups, the neighbors, the men and the women would participate in that. But the school kids would put on programs, have spelling bees and ciphering matches, and we'd go to other districts and match them. And that was a lot of fun. And we'd organize parties, for the church group especially. When we had parties through the week.
What kind of parties?
Well, we called them play parties. Actually, we played Skip-to-Maloo, and which was people that danced said we was dancing, but the church didn't like us to dance.
So you called it?
We called them play parties. And we had all kind of parties like that. I forget some of the games we played, but everybody knows Skip the Maloo. And let's see, some of the rest of them. Way down at the Popple Pats. And you dance and swing, and Virginia Reel. And we just had a great time in the wintertime. But we didn't have much time for parties in the summer. It was harvest and all that hard work. But we organized our own entertainment. And we'd have a party one week, and somebody say, "I'll come to my house next week." And that's the way it was done. And a lot of the grown-ups didn't even have children, wanted us to come have a party. Maybe we'd make taffy and have a taffy pull. Or maybe we'd popcorn and play our games. We had a lot of games we played just sitting down, Rin Tin Tin and Old Grandmother Fiddleberg and things like that. We didn't always.
What kind of a game is old grandmother something or other?
Well, you
Never
had
heard tell of it.
You know, they say old Grandmother Fiddleberg has gone somewhere. And what'd she take with her? Well, you had to tell everything she took. And the next person, and you would add one, and the next person had to remember all of them. And they'd add one. That'd go clear around the circle. And if you missed, then you had to be it. You had to get up and tell about old Grandmother Fiddleberg's trip.
Oh, dear. That was...
Rin Tin Tin was the same thing. You had a stick and you'd drum at their door, Rin Tin Tin, want to buy any tin? And they'd say, how much? And then they name all the stuff they wanted to buy. And you had to remember all that and go to the next neighbor. And we played blind man's buff, all kind of silly things. But we had great fun. And there was prizes, things like that, and a lot of excitement, we thought. But we had a good time, but we had to make our own fun. Never heard of a movie. And, you know, we didn't even have electricity. We had coal oil lamps, had to do our homework, and no telephone or...
When did you get telephones? Do you remember the first one that you...
do I remember. That was the most exciting thing. They was putting the wires in. Of course, you know, we had to have a railroad through the country, and that came first. And the little town of Tacoma, Oklahoma, opened up. And the first railroad came within 3.5 miles of our farm. And then you could have your telephone wires running into a central office. And that central office could put you in touch with Enid, Alva, all those adjoining towns.
That sort of followed the railroad then?
Yes.
Down the
telephones?
down the railroad tracks.
Oh, it was exciting. When the railroad come into town, the whole countryside went to see the first engine. I remember it so well, and it came down through the prairie, a puffing and a huffing and blowing its whistle and making the steam just fly, and then stopped right in town. But I can't remember just what year that was. George was a baby. And from that then went our telephones. And they took a long time to put these telephone wires and poles up all over that countryside. I can't remember how many we had on our line. It was too many because you couldn't hardly ever get in when you wanted to talk. But it was after everybody got a telephone, the women on the line, they called someone, and that person called someone else, and about a dozen women was on the line having fun visiting and trying out the telephone, and a man's voice broke in. And they tell about one woman dropped the receiver and fell under the table.
She was so excited. Who was that?
Well, Mrs. Huey, but I don't know who the man was that spoke in the telephone.
Yeah, she felt
Just
scolded or something.
Scared her.
Well,
Unexpected.
it was so new, they didn't hardly know how they operated. And everybody had a ring. Our ring was 51. That was a long and a short. And Grandpa and Grandma had a short and a long. Some people had 3 longs. And we had a book there listed with the people's name and the telephone ring.
Now, I suppose people on your own line, you could just ring yourself.
Right. But if we wanted to call an adjoining town, a community, we had to ring central. His was one long ring. And he'd answer, tell him who we wanted, and he had a list of names. He'd connect us. And so we could talk to quite a lot of places because we were among the last to get the telephone. But you know that was a godsend.
Oh, yes.
Before that, if you needed a doctor or an accident or anything, you had to go by horseback or foot or in your wagon. And that wasn't very fast.
Right. I remember your telling about being sick yourself when you were first starting to school.
Yes, I was. I was between 5 and 6. And I think my brother Jim rode horseback twice to get the doctor. The doctor wasn't at his office. Leave word for him to come to our house, but he didn't come. And so finally, my grandfather heard where the doctor was, and he went there and stayed until he was finished and brought him home with him. Probably saved my life because I was very ill, and to this day they don't know what was wrong. But he was a good doctor, and I think he saved my life. So you can see, there was no telephone then. We were still using motivation on foot or horseback or whatever. But I was delirious most of the time and don't remember too much about it. But it was one of the series. And I think my folks said that from the time Warb was a baby, a year old, they had never needed a doctor in the house till I was sick.
Oh my goodness.
So they were awfully lucky.
Well, they was very handy with illness. My father would have made a wonderful doctor. And a lot of times when neighbors were sick, even the doctor, when my sister was so ill, called my father and he says, I want you to go and take care of Grace. And he probably saved her life because he was just so good. And he had, everybody said he had surgeon's hands. He should have been a surgeon. But I know when we were sick, he could sit by our bed and stroke her hand or stroke her head. You'd feel better right away.
Didn't I hear that they set somebody's leg or something? What was that? I've forgotten that.
My brother Jim, you know, he was going out to the field on a hay rack. And a hay rack is a great big flat bed, and they don't want them so tall, you can't pitch your hay up on it. So the wheels come up through a hole, 4 wheels. And he got his foot in that wheel and was turning.
Goodness.
So my father got him straightened out, went back to the house. They decided his ankle was broke, so Mother and Daddy set it. And that's all that ever happened to it. They fixed it.
He didn't limp or anything?
Yes, I think he was left with a little limp
A little limp.
as long as he lived.
I was not aware of it. He always seemed okay to me.
I know that they didn't have any miracle drugs in those days. Mostly what did you treat wounds with?
Well, we always kept turpentine and camphor at the house, always. And in the winter, my folks would have cream of tartar, and they'd mix a great big jar of cream of tartar. They had the right...
What would that do?
Well, it's good for you. It's supposed to keep you from having colds and your blood get too thick through the winter months, eating heavy food like you had on the farm. And we'd have maybe a tablespoonful of it every night before we went to bed. And then in the spring, we'd have sassafras tea every morning for breakfast. And that was supposed to condition you to be ready for the hot weather.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I heard him say something about cream of tartar in the medical world just the other day, and that reminded me of our cream of tartar. It wasn't bad to take. We didn't question it at all. We were supposed to take it.
You're supposed to take it, you take it.
And, of course, the sassafras tea was good. We liked that. We thought that was great. We had that for breakfast every morning in the spring. So their motive was try to keep us well. But, oh, we had tonsillitis, and we had all kind of sickness. But I don't remember us ever having a doctor for it. And we had smallpox.
As a family?
The
whole
whole
family?
The whole family.
Goodness.
I was the first one to come down with it.
About how old were you?
You know, I was quite young. I just can't remember.
Had you gone to school yet?
I was in school. That's where we picked it up. We picked it up at school. But I was kind of I don't know, I always picked up the germs and come down with the measles and everything first. But with just home remedies cured us. Never had a doctor for those
Did you
things.
all have it at once?
Practically, the smallpox we did, and the measles. I was the first one to come down with it, but all of them come down following in just a few days. It was terrible, and everybody was pretty sick with it. So I never expect to have the measles again.
So who took care of feeding people and everything?
Well, of
When
course,
you were all sick?
my father and mother had it, so they could stay well.
They
Yes.
stayed well.
And the mother could manage. You're not very hungry, you know, when you're that sick.
Oh, all right.
She can manage, and Daddy always stayed in and helped. And of course, if we wanted something special, why, if we wanted toast or something like that, he'd fix that for us. And that was a treat. We didn't have toasters. We just had the coals red hot in the old cook stove, and he'd put his bread on a fork and hold it over those hot coals. That made the best toast you ever ate.
Sounds
It is.
good.
It's just different. And home-baked bread, we never.
You always baked your bread.
Every other day, we made 9 loaves, and on Saturday, we made 11.
Why did you make so many on Saturday?
Well, we didn't want to bake on Sunday.
Oh,
See, and we always planned on having a lot of company
I see.
over the weekend. So on Monday, we'd go back to our potato bread. We always had potato bread. Mother gave $1 for a recipe when she was a young bride for a recipe to make potato bread. And we never had anything else in our house. And I still say it's the best bread that ever was made. It was so good. We used potato water and the potatoes and sugar and salt and yeast. And we kept starter in a big jar and set that jar out in the milk tank to keep it fresh and cool. And baking every other day, you could keep a starter like that. But if you kept it too long, it'd, what they call, they die. Just wasn't any good. But I baked potato bread for years with a small family. I made a starter like that, and I just put the yeast in it. And when that was light, I put the flour in. But I haven't baked potato bread for a long time. But I've sure given a lot of people recipes for it right there when I lived on the farm. But it's just different. And just things like that, you know, everybody did their own thing and made the best of what they had until it got so we had vegetation, we had some trees, and we had more rainfall and less dust storms. Those dust storms were terrific. I've seen a wall of dust come down over the prairie just like a cloud. And when it hit the house, it hit the windows just like you're throwing rocks at it. Only small. And it was just dark as night until that first wall would pass on. But they don't have that anymore. As soon as we got trees and vegetation, why, it cut down a lot on the dust storms.
Not only dust storms, but you had prairie fires, too.
Yes, we did. Had prairie fires and nothing to fight with except just your volunteer neighbors. And they'd start right away plowing a fire guard. You can't do that in the forest. It's too thick. You can't hardly make a fire guard. They can burn one. But somebody would start circling a big place the way the fire was going and plow a great big field of dirt, and it'd be wide enough the fire wouldn't jump it.
Wouldn't jump
They'd
that.
just take barrels of water in a wagon and old gunny sacks, and they'd go along that fire line, just try to put it out with those wet sacks.
Beating it out.
Yes, and they did a pretty good job fighting fires. But those prairie fires, when the wind blew,
I
they just-
suppose they started by lightning or something like
quite
that.
often, and carelessness. I don't know that I ever heard of one starting by
Arsonist.
yes, I don't know that I did.
Life was probably too serious for that.
Yeah. But they were terrible. They could wipe out a farm in no time at all.
You hear so much about tornadoes right now. Did you ever have tornadoes in those days?
Oh, they had lots of tornadoes. That was the name of the game. I don't think we ever had one at our farm. 5 miles was the closest, and that was one of the largest tornadoes I ever remember in that part of the country. But we stood out in our front yard and watched that tornado perform. It was just a dust. And you know, they'll come down, and sometimes when they're coming down, they'll just hit the dirt, and that dirt will just boil up. I can see it to this day. And then they start going up in the cloud again. They take all that dirt, your house, your trees, and everything with them. and it took one family's house up with it and just carried it around and whirled it around with the mother and her 2 daughters in it and set it down not very far from where it had been. But it crippled them up. It just, the one girl had a broken arm, and she had to go for help, and when she got for help, that house wasn't there. It had just slid across the big field and put the dirt up on the porch as high as this divan.
Just scraped it along.
Just pushed it along. And they said they could go into their cave. You know, they had caves. They could go from their kitchen into their cave. And they all ran into the cave. But they had pulled cornbread for supper out on the oven door. It sat right there through that whole trip. It was just a push. And then it come back up in the air, traveled in the air a while, and then it come down and hit a great big farmhouse and went down over a landscape of a hill. It absolutely made kindling out of it. I've got a picture somewhere. 30 head of cattle went down over that hill, all dead when they got there. And the sticks all down of that house, down over that. Now that is about the closest it come to our house. And the air was just dead. And once in a while, a big hailstone would hit the house because there was so much action up in that cloud. It was all afternoon gathering, all afternoon. And we, of course, if we'd noticed or felt that it was coming at us, we could have gone to our cave. But we could watch. Well, when you think they're standing still, they're traveling right at you. They're not standing still. That thing traveled for a mile. It went clear into Missouri. It followed the Salt Fork River and just damaged houses and land all the way. That was terrible, and I sure remember that one.
I wonder about how old you were.
Oh, that was the summer Grace was married. And
So your mother was still living?
yes, mother was still living. And I think that it was 1908. If I remember correctly, it was 1908, shortly before Grace was married. And of course, we were all pretty much alone then. But we all stood out there and watched that tornado. And the next day, I went with my uncle and aunt to see the destruction. And after that, I said I'd believe anything they told me about a tornado. I saw a parasol driven into a tree and hadn't even tore the material over it, just driven. And the steel part was sticking out the other side of the tree, and chickens running around, stripped of all their feathers. And that was where they picked up the house and just whirled it in the air, set it back down. They really performed something. And there's always hail and wind and rain. And people that have lived to go up in that cloud, they say that it's just devastating to see what's flying around them. 2x4s and everything from a home or a barn, and they're just awful lucky to get back down alive. And a lot of them have been up in those tornadoes and set back down in an area where they could talk about it. But they are just, but I think they have more nowadays than ever before.
Or maybe we hear about every one, whereas when you were so isolated and communication was such a problem, you didn't hear about the ones over in the next county.
I know
Or
it.
at least right away.
Yeah. But the little town of Carmen, 12 miles from us, was positively blown away one year. But we had a bad storm at our place. But I don't ever remember of us going to the cave. They had a cave. But Daddy always waited and looked at the clouds, summed them up. He didn't think it was necessary to go to the cave. It's a job, you know. Get up in the night and steer everybody in the dark down into the storm cellar, they called it. But we were lucky. We weren't
Yes, I
in
should
the-
say.
Yeah, we weren't in the line of traffic, but they still have tornadoes in that area. They just follow a pattern,
Grandpa Hopkins lived right there close to you.
2 miles.
And had he come from Kansas originally?
Yes.
Or where was
Well,
he from?
they moved to Kansas when my mother was 10 years old, from Pennsylvania, from Keystone County, Pennsylvania. And after he donated the land for the school. They named that school Keystone. Later built a church, and that was called Keystone. And that was in respect to his donation. But when the consolidation come into effect, then the little schools all went. So that's just converted back to farmland now.
Right.
So-
And then where did your grandfather, Provost, live?
In Illinois, in Decatur.
You went there once?
I've never visited Decatur.
When you were a child, did you go there?
No, he had moved. You see, he moved his little family to Kansas.
Oh, I
as
see.
a young father, and their mother died and left 7 children. So he sold out and went back to Decatur. So he had sisters and brothers to help him raise his family. So that was quite a little family, to be left. And so then later, he always lived in Decatur after that. He never come west. But my father, at the age of 16, and his older brother, must have been close to 20, Uncle Jim, came to Kansas to make a home for themselves. And my father had 2 yoke of oxen, and he did custom plowing. That's the way he made his living at first. Then he soon had horses, and he could farm and work, and he did a lot of plowing and farming all over the area to make his money.
And he
then
was just 16 or so.
that's where he met my mother. He met my mother, and they were married there at Norwich, Kansas, and settled down on a little area farm. Then soon they opened up a creamery. He and his brother-in-law opened up a creamery and a butcher shop. And they was doing real well, but the whole thing burned to the ground.
Oh, my.
And so then he went back to farming. But it seemed like he could almost do anything. He could just visualize how it was going to turn out. But I don't remember how come the creamery burned. But that was all the money invested and had to start all over again. But I think Warb and Jim remembered it, the burning. So then he just farmed.
When you lived down in Oklahoma in those early days, were there any black people moved there?
We had, so to speak, 2 families, but they were all related. The one was married, had a wife and a child, and his mother and 2 brothers lived in another house. And those young people went to school with I don't remember whether I ever went to school with them or not. I went to school then with their nephew when he started, Dwight, but that was the only black people there was in our community. And then the Jim Crow law come in, so the district had
What
to
do you mean? What law?
They had to go, they couldn't go to the white school anymore.
Oh, really?
Yes.
There was a law to that effect?
Yes.
Before that, they had been accepted?
Yes.
And went right to
Yeah.
school with you?
But the district had to raise money and pay for that young man to go to Wichita, Kansas school.
Well, for pity's sakes.
And he wasn't there too long. He got in trouble. But he come out all right. But, we just thought they was neighbors. We just regarded them, and they were fine people. And helped in the harvest. My father would cut their wheat, and they would furnish the team and the header barge and work with them, all of them. But the one family finally moved away. In fact, they both did. They both moved back down in close to the Indian Nation. But it wasn't because they were rejected or anything like that. But, what I mean, the Jim Crow law, a colored person couldn't go into a restaurant, certain restaurant, and eat. And they had to leave town before the sun went down.
Oh, my. Isn't
My
that interesting?
soul.
Didn't you ever hear of that? No. Well, your history books will tell you.
Well, we think of that as the Deep South, and I guess we don't think of Oklahoma as the
No.
South.
That was in Kansas and Oklahoma, as much as in. Well, you can remember when they had to sit in the back of a streetcar.
Well, I remember that they did, but I didn't know they had to.
Yes, they did. And where they sat up in the balcony at a picture show, they never sat down on the first floor with the white people. And after we come to Denver, restaurants opened up, so that a colored person would be allowed to go into any restaurant and eat. When we first come here, they had trouble.
Isn't that interesting?
There weren't very many though here.
Not then. There wasn't very many. No. So,
Well, did you have much contact with Indians?
well, my grandfather did. Now, we didn't see the Indians. I suppose the first real settlement was about 30 or 40 miles from us, more down where your Grandpa Browns lived. But my grandfather, Hopkins, loved to hunt, and he loved to trade with the Indians. And he had a way. He could speak enough of their language that he could deal with them. And he just kid them around and trade them anything he had. Maybe if he hunted and shot a deer, he'd trade them the deer for some trinkets like beaded moccasins. And he'd bring us strands of Indian beads. Always come home with something for us. But he just loved. And he'd go to what you call the Indian powwows. They'd put on a show. I've gone with them down to Cleo, and the Indians would dance half the night and have their music going. I was kind of scared myself. I didn't want them to come too close, but I should never have been afraid when I was with Grandpa, because he was their friend and they knew it. But down where your Grandpa and Grandma Brown lived, they had a store, a little Staples of all kind of little things that you could buy and groceries, and ran the post office. That was called Chester, Oklahoma, and that is still a post office. And they was right in quite close to Indians. And, you know, everybody had a heating stove. If they had a second story, that pipe went up through that ceiling, and there'd be quite a little distance around that stovepipe. But when she saw the Indians coming, she'd send her little children upstairs. But she didn't seem to be afraid herself. And my husband tells about they'd all get down on their knees around that little hole and peek and watch the Indians, scared to death. They'd make a noise and they'd come up there and get them. But your grandmother was a very cool, calm, and collected woman, and she didn't run from them at all. They'd come in there and talk their language. She didn't know what they was talking about. She could usually figure it out and trade with them, give them their little staples and everything, but they was right down there close to the Indians and dealt with them quite a bit. And if our plantation hadn't been underwater, we'd have lived down there too.
You'd have been living down there.
Yeah.
But it was better to live up close to Grandpa
I
Hopkins,
think so. I think it was a community developed faster. And they developed the school, and the school was the center of all social gatherings. Had church there.
And don't you think just having your grandpa and grandma close, you had a lot more socialization and somebody to care about you?
That's right, we did. And my grandfather and grandmother was highly respected. They just thought they could seek advice from them for anything. And Grandpa was pretty clever. He could help a lot of people. And they lived to be quite old, but always well thought of. And they called him he could counsel with people and figure out their love affairs and figure out their money affairs. And that's the kind of a reputation he had. But he was a grand old person, I'll tell you.
You were real fond of your grandmother, too.
Oh, yes. She was a little woman, but boy, she was a walking dictionary for us kids. We loved her. Some of us stayed with them most of the time. They'd be there just for company, run little errands for them, and they loved that. But it was hard. We were such a clannish bunch, we couldn't stay very long. We got homesick. It was too quiet. We had something going on at home all the time. One time, your father come up there to bring we only lived 5 miles apart. We didn't know each other. But he come up there to bring a public speaker. He was going to speak at the schoolhouse. And when he got back home, his mother said, "Oh, what were Provost doing?" "Oh, they're having a party."
And it was just the bunch.
We was making ice cream, really. But we just playing around all over the yard like we did. "Oh, they're having a party." She found afterwards they didn't.
Yeah.
Just a lot of activity going on. He wasn't used to that.
Right.
But that was about the way it was. We was full of a lot of action. Had a lot of fun. Had fun going all the time. Teasing somebody or picking on somebody, but we didn't quarrel a lot. We wasn't allowed to. We had to figure it all out.
Yeah.
Had to live pretty peaceable. And we learned to do that quite young.
Right.
But it was a hub of activities. And like I said, the schoolhouse was the center. And we just had lots of things going on there.
Yeah. Then Aunt Nina was the youngest one in your family, right?
Yes. Yeah. Nina was just 2 months old when Mother died. And of course, that was probably the saddest day in our lives. It was such a shock. And
Had she been ill?
she hadn't been in real good health, but I didn't think she was that sick. In my day and age, I thought that we could just doctor up and fix anything. And but my father was quite concerned, and he had taken her to the doctor on Sunday because I didn't go to Sunday school. I stayed home to help with the work and take care of the baby. That winter, I didn't go to school very much. I was needed at home more, and I stayed home lots of days. And so he took her to the doctor on Sunday, and they come home, and he didn't inform us, but the doctor had told him she could die any time. Her heart was so bad, but he didn't tell anybody except Clarence. And she was up on Sunday. The kids were all home, and as usual, all out playing hide and seek. That was our pastime on Sunday afternoons. Jim and Ruby was there, and
Because they were married then.
Yeah, yes. And Willie was little. They was there that winter. And I remember Grandpa and Grandma come over. But Grandma said something to me. She says, you know your mother's awful sick. But I didn't know what she meant. She saw the way Mother was breathing. So come Monday, we got up as usual, had our breakfast. Mother was up. But I stayed home from school. That was wash day. And Clarence was to help me. And Daddy was taking care of Mother. And she was sitting in the big rocking chair, had her pillow under her arm, holding her baby. And finally, Daddy said, I think that you should lay down a while. She didn't want to go to bed. So they called me in to take over, take the baby and give her bath, dress her up. We dressed the babies in pretty clothes every day. And so Daddy took Mother and tucked her in. And when she lay down, she said, if anything happens to me, take good care of my children, especially my baby. And you know, that stayed with him all of his life. He would anyway. But 6 o'clock that night, she was dead. And there was nobody there to help us. And the doctor just went to the phone. He was there. He went to the phone and he gave those 14 little rings. And everybody rushed to the phone at that time. And he told him, he says, Mrs. Provost is dead and we need help. Well, it wasn't an hour till practically every neighbor was represented at that house, trying to see if they could do anything. And of course, we did need help. And a lot of them stayed overnight. And it turned cold. I'll tell you this, that was one of those warm February days when the wind was blowing. And it got so dusty, we couldn't hang the clothes out. So we left them hanging in the tubs, in the washing machine, in the clear water, and we just left them. Well, that night, the wind changed, and it turned to bitter cold. I think the next day was one of the coldest days I ever remember in my life.
And that was your birthday, too.
It was my birthday. I was 15, and Nina was 2 months. And Clarence and I decided we had to dry those clothes. So we just dipped them out of the water into tubs and carried them. We had a great big clothes yard, we called it, all wire lines, a great big area with clothespins. But all we did was pick up the clothes and throw them across the line. Couldn't hang them up, you'd freeze. And by the time they hit the line, they froze stiff, and they'd freeze dry. The clothes all froze dry. And we needed some of them. As soon as they was dry, we'd bring them in, start ironing, and get the clothes ready, because we had a funeral to face and a lot of children to dress. So the neighbors all helped. We got the washing all froze dry, and The next day, thank goodness, on Wednesday, the sun did come out and it warmed up. But it wasn't a warm day at that. But we could all go to the funeral except the baby. And it was a large funeral. And a lot of people didn't know about it. It was so sudden. They didn't even know. People in the various towns around. Mm-hmm. But from then on, Merle, which was 17 and I was 15, we were kind of father and mother because Daddy had so much to do. And immediately, my young married sister gave birth to her first child and had a long sick spell, really almost died. And as I told you, the doctor often called him to go help with sickness.
Called your dad?
Yes.
Your father?
Yeah. And so I went to see her. The baby was 3 days old, and I wanted to take my little sister, but it was too bad. Daddy says, you better go see your sister, and you can take the baby later. It was a cold day, but I went buggy and horse and drove up there several miles. When I got there, the doctor was there, and 2 or 3 neighbor women. They informed me my sister was real sick. And so the doctor come to me, and he says, is your father home? I said, yes. He's home taking care of the children. He says, when you get home, you tell him to call me. So I went right home. But before I got home, the doctor had got to a telephone, and he called Daddy. He says, I want you to go and take care of Grace. So he was ready to go when I got home. And he went to take care of his daughter, who was at the point of death for several days, and he stayed there until she was recovered. So it was up to Merle and I to take care of the little flock at home. And you know, it was pretty hard.
How many did you have then at home?
Well, there was 6 younger than I was.
Yeah.
But Wilma and Imogene was 11 and 13. And George had never gone to school. See, there was 4 children under school age.
Mm-hmm. That's quite a big responsibility.
It was, and an awful lot of questions to answer. It was a real sad time. But Merle and I had taken care of the children so much, they just kind of organized, and everything went pretty smooth. And then in June, I would say, my father was injured, and it was quite serious. He couldn't be up at all. But at that time, the baby was sick, real sick.
What happened to your father?
Well, he was helping them put hay in the barn. And you know, we had that big barn, a big hay fork. That hay fork would come down, and it would pick up a quarter of a load of alfalfa hay. And it was powered by a team of horses. And you know, if you've ever seen a wagon, you know they have a double tree and 2 single trees. And the single trees is what the team was hitched to. But the double tree carries a load. Well, he didn't have a wagon or anything. They carried that double tree and just drove the team to raise that fork up in the barn. Mm. And all at once, the hay was dumped back on the hay rack, and the boys knew something had happened. Well, the double tree broke and hit him in the side. And of course, they run to his aid. He tried to stumble over under a shade tree, and he's the kind that fainted. He fainted and was in bad shape. But that's what happened. That double tree broke, and a piece of it hit him in the side, and he was bedfast. And but the baby was already sick, had been sick for days.
That was Nina.
Yes. And
what was the matter with her?
Well, they called it summer complaint. I think it was, she was a bottle baby raised on cow's milk, and I think something went wrong with the cow's milk because we always had to sterilize it. And when we sterilized that, it curdled, and that's a sign it's no good. We had changed cow's milk and didn't agree with her. And she just really was sick. And we couldn't seem to, doctor come see her every day, just couldn't straighten her out. And so, of course, it was a terrible pill for Daddy to take, think he couldn't get up and take care of that baby. But I sat for days with that little thing in my lap, and a hot summer day wrapped in a blanket. And one night she was cold, clear up to here. I said she was more dead than alive. And so the doctor came the next day, And my sister was there with her young baby, and he just turned to her and he says, "Have you plenty of milk for your baby?" She says, "I could feed two." He says, "That's the answer. We've got to have mother's milk for this baby." So that we arranged for, I went home with Grace and took the baby. And the next day, my father got on his feet and put his pants over his nightshirt. He'd jump his buggy and horse and come up there. He was going to take care of those babies and help in some way. So I would go days and help with the children and try to keep him from overdoing. And then I'd go home at night to be with the little children at home.
Oh,
so we did that for days, but I tell you, that baby sure come out of it. Oh, she was just a beauty in no time. But that was a lifesaver. And that was that was about the first 8 months of being without mother, and it was just one tragedy after another. Mm-hmm. But after Nina got well and on her feet, things went along pretty smooth then. Mm-hmm. For a while, a lot of work, but then Daddy's around the house an awful lot. And he was a good mother and father both. He could do anything about the house that any woman could do. He could make that bread, he could churn the butter, and he could scrub and wash and do anything that needed to be done.
You told us one time that he also did a lot of things like have a blacksmith shop. And
oh, yes.
All the people came to have him do the
That picture
work.
don't show his shop, but he had a big, long building built, and it doesn't show in that picture. And one end of that was his blacksmith shop. He had everything. He had a big bellows, you know, that heat those coals, red hot, and he had that quite early. And you know, when they was breaking sod, they had to have their plowshares sharp. And they could hear him all over the neighborhood hammering out the plowshares, sharpening them up for the neighbors as early as 4 o'clock in the morning, because it meant an awful lot to them to break the sod to get the sod house built, and to clear the ground.
So you could plant a crop.
And crops, yes. But the neighbors would come sometimes and work in the shop themselves if they had the skill. But his big anvil he had come from Decatur. And I don't know whether he went back and got it or how he got it there. But that was there as long as that farm stood. Mm-hmm. That shop was there and that big anvil. And I can just see him yet, you know, after he sharpened a plowshare, had a big tub of water, and he'd put that down in there to cool. The water just sizzle and boil for a little bit. Then he'd look it over to make sure it was sharp. But he could sharpen plowshares and fix anything. And that made him a little exchange work. He'd exchange work for neighbors to come and help him do something. And that was most of the income from that, and his own plow, too, you know. He had to break a lot of sod. He rented a school section, a school quarter, right across the road from our farm. See, that was government land. And he rented that for years and was just prairie. They called it grazing land. And the cattlemen in Kansas would drive big herd of cattle down there, and he'd pasture them all winter because they had more farmland and less grass. So that made a lot of money. Not a lot, some money off the school land. Then finally, the government decided to sell that land. They sold so much school land off at auction, and he bought it. He bought it then, that was ours, right across the road from the homestead. So finally it was quite a bit of farmland, but a certain amount of it was always kept for grazing, for your cattle.
Well, he grew a lot of different crops, didn't he?
Oh yes, he never depended on one thing, not one single thing. He had Capricorn and corn, and he finally went into alfalfa and wheat and oats, and if one crop failed, he had another one. And that's where so many people in the early day made the mistake. They just plant wheat, or they'd plant corn. If it failed, they just about go broke. I think it was because he had the foresight, and he had always had a dairy herd, and he raised the pigs. He didn't have a little pig pen. He had a big lot, and he planted it to alfalfa and different crops so they could graze just like cattle. And he'd shipped them with a carload. And they would, he watched the market. he got the Wichita paper, watched the market. When he thought it was about time to sell, he'd figure whether he had a carload or not. If he didn't, he'd go to all the neighbors and buy a few more. They'd want to sell. And they'd drive these pigs to market on foot. They'd start way early in the morning, he and the boys, most of them on foot, a couple horseback, and they'd just drive them down the section line, great big drove a pig like he was driving cattle, load them on the train there at Hewitt, and he'd ride the train with them to Wichita and sell his crop. But he did that for a long time. And then he got thoroughbred Jersey cows, always had thoroughbred cows to sell, and always had horses, well broke and well trained. He never depended on any one thing, and we depended on our products, from the milk and the butter and the eggs and the chickens, to practice at your table. And you raised your beef and you raised your pork, and he knew how to cure it because he'd had a butcher shop, and he could make the best cured pork. It wasn't anything unusual for a butcher to render out 40 gallons of lard, and you use that to fry your potatoes, to make your pie crust, make your biscuits and everything. That was the only shortening we had except butter. So that's the way we lived. We just produced it. And that's what made it possible for him to prosper and build up a nice home and still feed his big family. So it's been...
He even did molasses.
Oh, yes, he raised cane and made sorghum molasses. And I can certainly remember that, because I'd go to the field and help strip the cane. You have to strip all the leaves off. But first they'd top the heads off. Then they'd strip all the leaves off. And then they'd come along with their little sled with a big knife on it, driving a horse, and they'd cut the stalks off and stack them, finally haul them up to the sorghum mill. And it had two great big huge wood rollers. And he had made a great big vat to cook the sorghum in, and that was powered. The mill that ground out the juice of the cane was powered by a horse. It had a one horse, a great big apparatus out here, and old Joe would go around in a circle all day long, and somebody'd feed that cane stalks into those rollers, and the juice would run out in a big container, poured over in the big vat, and fire under it. And they fixed up a big high seat for Mother, and he made a big long thing to stir it, big long handle, back away from the heat, and it had a thing on the end, so you could sit there and you had to stir it to keep it from scorching, because it was just like sugar, you know. And cook that down, skim off the top, so it wouldn't be nice and clear, not strong. He'd do that, and it was quite. And then he emptied that in barrels, and neighbors would come and buy sorghum molasses with a gallon, a quart, whatever. But it was really good, I can tell you that. It was better than you could buy today. And the juice, I can remember, we used to take a stalk of that cane, and you'd turn it like this and break the center. That was the best juice you ever ate. It was so sweet. That's what made you sorghum, that juice from that cane. But I don't think he made sorghum more than 2 or 3 years. And I don't know, other things was more profitable and more productive to have the cane field planted or something else. But that was an experience for us kids.
Right, I bet it
I
was.
could just see that juice running out of those big wooden rollers, just feed it in there, and here hung this big container.
He must have sort of made that sorghum mill himself.
I don't know whether he did or not. He made so many things, it's possible.
Because,
I just don't know. But they still make sorghum now in Oklahoma, the southeastern part, south of Oklahoma City. But we never buy any of it up where we live. But it is good. So we just went, so many things. He had so many things going all the time. And that's why we lived and prospered and always had food and clothing. And so many of those early settlers lost their land. They didn't know how to manage.
And they just had to give up.
Yeah. And then, later he farmed to Grandpa Hopkins' farm because he wasn't able to. So the boys would go up there and fix that up for him. He'd harvest the wheat and everything. But they lived on that farm a good many years. And just think, A lot of people say, why did people do it? Why did they leave a country that was progressing and you had cities, towns, and everything? They had hope of a home that they owned. That was the whole thing. Go away and get that land for practically nothing. If you could face the hardships, you had a home. Now, I know of one farm that sold just a few weeks ago. It was a homestead, and the person lost it. He didn't prosper. And one of my relatives had come out from Pennsylvania, thought it was a good investment. He bought it for $1,029. And a month or so ago, it sold for $100,020.
$120,000.
Uh-huh. And it was partly wheat and partly grazing land. But that's how the country progressed. That's one example. But they had their low tide and their high tide.
Right.
When you couldn't hardly sell your farm for taxes.
Yeah.
If we had a failure, crop failure. But one thing about our family, we had our products to depend on.
Other things.
Always raised enough feed for your cattle. You had your own milk. You had butter. We have made as much as 40 pounds of butter in a week to sell. It wasn't unusual.
So they took it to town to sell?
And you churned it by hand?
Yes, we had what we called a big barrel churn. I think it would hold 5 gallons of cream. And my father had that cream tempered just right. He had a thermometer, and he never let that cream get too old to be sweet cream. And he'd test that cream before we churned, and we'd turn it in that crank, and that barrel went over and over and over till we had butter. And then we all learned how to drain the buttermilk off, and we washed the butter with water a couple of times and got all that milk out. And then the big fun was to get it out in the big butter bowl. And that big old paddle we had, we just work it till we got every drop of buttermilk and water out of it. And then another trick was salt it a little bit. And then we had a big round butter mold that held 1 pound, had a beautiful flour on the top, made a beautiful pound of butter. And that's what you sold. And then later they come out with a square butter mold. And it never was pretty. It was just a pound of butter in a square. But there's an awful lot to making butter and making good butter. And we had good butter and good bread, always. I'll tell you that. And he knew how to, being a creamer man, he knew how to handle the cream and make the good butter, and we all learned from him.
I believe I remember that he was tempted to leave Oklahoma after your mother died.
Yes, he was, of course, left without the mainstay. And there was a big drive on great country down in Florida. And they was running big excursion trips. And he and the neighbor decided they'd go look it over. I think he felt he ought to just make a new start. Just felt discouraged. But when he come back, he was happy to stay right where he was. He knew that that wasn't the place to raise a family. And he didn't like the climate, he didn't like anything. So he was satisfied when he come back. But that's what made him do it. Whenever he thought he could better himself, he always looked into it. That's why he went to Oklahoma and left Kansas. That's why he come back to Kansas and left Illinois. He thought he could better himself. But I think he did. You know, long ago, the land in Illinois was expensive. Awfully hard for a young person to get ahead to buy a piece of land. You just had to be a sharecropper or whatever you want to call it, just rent. And that was the only hope those early settlers had, was owning their own land.
So after your mother died, then you pretty much had the responsibility, you and Uncle Merle, for the little kids.
We did.
For how long did you have to do that?
Well, my father married again. Nina, I think, was about 3.5 or 4. And there was a lot of adjustment to make there. She was a fine woman. She took on a big responsibility. And I think, as a whole, we all helped her. And I taught her everything she knew. I had to teach her to make the bread and everything. And she could sew, though, and she was very willing. So I had decided that really I was teaching her and sort of had the reins, but I thought it was time for me to move on and let her have a chance. So I decided to go to school, back to school after all those pitiful years of education. So I was interested in school at Guthrie. It was called the Methodist University. So I hauled off and got real sturdy, and I went to school, and that was a pretty big break, you know, and I was tied in so close at home. But I made the best of it, and I stayed a certain length of time, and that's where I met your father. Even though we had lived 5 miles apart, we had nothing in common with the school districts, the town, or anything. But we weren't there very long until we met, and went to, you know, to all the public functions together, the football games, and so rode the train home together when we come home for Christmas, and arrived at the same station and everything. We was that close all those years. But it grew into quite a romance and a marriage. And if you look at that picture last night, I had 2 daughters, and there was all their ancestors.
all their descendants.
Yeah, their descendants.
You're the
Yes.
ancestor.
Some of my ancestors. Well,
So, what did you do when you were dating and so forth and so on?
well, there wasn't much to do. They had lectures at the university, and he was quite an athlete. He was interested in, he was a wonderful ball player and track man.
Baseball and track.
Yeah.
I remember that he went out for football.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. The coach says, listen, he says, you wouldn't last any time at all running like you do. He says, you'd get crippled and couldn't do anything. He says, I want you to center on track and baseball. He took him off the football field. And I think that's true. Whatever he did with all of his might, and he was a racer. And he'd get out, and he wasn't very tall. And he didn't have a chance with all those big guys. He liked football, but he liked baseball better. It was all right. Turned out great.
yes.
So I still have some of his medals that he won, and he was quite a player in the ball game. He was the catcher, but he could knock the home runs too when he got up to that.
I remember you talking about rooming with some girls, and how you divided up the money and paid your rent.
There wasn't any of it. I tell you, when we went away to school, it was kind of a depression time. We'd had a drought, and talk about hot weather, and everybody was a little short on money. And so there was 5 of us living in this house. We all had our own department of bedrooms, but we all shared the kitchen. And we'd put 25 cents in the kitty, buy our groceries, took turns of cooking, and when the kitty was empty, we all went 25 cents again. Can you imagine?
25 cents going anywhere for groceries?
You could buy a lot of groceries with that money then.
Oh.
Probably butter was, eggs 10 cents a dozen, loaf of bread 5 cents, and that meant a lot, you know. But that way we kept it equal, you know.
You
All
went
for
over
the-
to Guthrie to college. How far was that from home?
Too far, I thought.
That was quite a ways.
Yeah, I got pretty homesick, and my brother Merle brought Nina down to see me at Thanksgiving. That helped a lot. They stayed for a few days. We had a lot of get-togethers because a whole bunch there with your father got acquainted with the people that was with him, and we went on hikes and did a lot of things during the vacation. So I was pretty happy, and then went home at Christmas, and then in the spring I became ill, and they decided afterwards it was more of a exhaustion. They couldn't put the finger on any special disease, but I was exhausted. I think fighting the tension,
And the homesickness?
yes, and the book learning, hide. And that was kind of hard for me after all the years of doing what I was doing.
Hoeing.
And finally, it just got the best of me. So I went home. I didn't go back to school. But your father stayed and finished his business course. And he come home for harvest. And, eventually...
Then you got engaged. You were engaged then?
Yes, soon after that. And then we was married the next December.
Yeah, are you going to tell us about this or not?
Well, it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, I think it's fun.
Well, we had quite a romance. And we had the wedding all set and all the invitations printed. And practically a week left to make the final arrangements. And his folks decided against the wedding.
Oh.
It was pretty bitter, a shock.
Oh, I can imagine.
But he wasn't to be defeated. Your father wasn't a man of defeat. So they decided they was going to send him out of the country. So they packed him up, bought a ticket, and I don't know why, they just bought it to Carmen.
Well, or else he just got off and got a refund.
Now, he could have done that. I'm not sure about. I've been trying to figure that out.
But he was being sent to Kansas City, right?
Yes. He was headed for
think
Kansas
that's-
City.
yes, I think
but
that's
instead
the way
he,
he tells
he
it.
appeared at my house. He got a team to bring him out there, hired them to bring him out there. And in the meantime, we all powwowed and figured it out. We could rake up enough money, and we decided. Now, my folks didn't object to it. They objected strenuously to the Browns' action. And
Well, it was too late to change plans.
well, it just wasn't to be, that's all. It wasn't going to best him. So, had to send him to Kansas City. That was supposed to be the end of everything. But it was a long time before they found out that he wasn't in Kansas City. And so, we got enough money together that we decided to go to Texas, down to my aunt's. She had a little farm down there, and that would take us out of the country, away from the clutter of his folks fussing at us. So we bought a ticket to Durant, Oklahoma. No, I think we bought the ticket to Houston, Texas, but we got off of Durant and got married. We decided against going into Texas, so we got married. Then we went on to Houston. And we didn't stay there too long on the little truck farm. They had a tenant house. We set up housekeeping there, and he helped Uncle George with the crops. And then their son-in-law heard of this good job down at Port Arthur, Texas. So we talked to the man that had been talking to Chris, and he hired Daddy to go down there and work in the oil fields, help building those big supply storage tanks. So we worked down there, made real good money and saved it, decided to come home on a little visit in September and was going to go back. But instead, we just stopped off in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was a oil town. But instead of getting a job with the oil company, he got a job with a big fair that was going on there. It was called dryland farming. And of course, he was still kind of interested in trying to help the dryland farmers. He got a good job there, and that lasted until almost Christmas. And then they folded, because that was fall, kind of like a county fair. And all this new equipment helped the dryland farmers and everything. And so then he went from there to a newspaper office in Muskogee. So we stayed in Muskogee until spring, and we come home for your grandparents' silver anniversary. They wanted us to go home. So we came home for that, and then we went back to Tulsa.
Now that was the Browns
Yes.
that you came home
Yes.
to, and they were all over their
Oh,
concern
yes.
about
They got
your-
over it right away when we come home in September. We just, of course, we went to my folks first. And my folks kind of hated to have me go down there. They said, I wouldn't go, let Harold go. No, I said, I'm going. I'm going. I said, whatever they've got to say is all right. So, and boy, they just agreed just like nothing had ever happened. Just tickled to death, alive, I guess. But I don't know how they found out we'd married, but, you know, it went all over, oh, Caddie Broken-Hill, Brown eloped. And I think that's the way they heard it. Alice, I think, heard it at school. And then Grandpa didn't like to be vested by his own child. He didn't like it at all. He was just going to bring us back and have that wedding annulled. Grandma says, I'll never lay a straw in their way.
So that took care of that.
That stopped that when she wasn't going to take part in it. So we was gone almost a year, and then, you know, come back home for that silver anniversary. We went down there to see them, and everything was just fine.
I know you showed us this picture one time saying that this was the group that actually came for your wedding.
Yes.
Of course, you weren't there. But.
Yeah, that's actually the group. My bridesmaid was there. Didn't have time to notify her. Mildred Green came from Kansas. She brought her brother Lawrence. Most of the rest of them are just people there, relatives.
That would have been
We'd
there
been there
anyway.
for Christmas dinner anyway.
Because you were going to be married on Christmas.
Yes.
And instead you got married on the 19th of December.
That's right. So that's the way that came about. Well, it made history.
I bet it did. But I know Grandma and Grandpa Brown actually felt warmer toward you than even their own daughters. I know they just loved you to death.
I didn't have any trouble with it ever.
And,
No.
and that's understandable, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I think they made it up to me many times. And they never come right out and said anything, but you could tell by their actions.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about where Daddy came from. Where was he born?
He was born in Kansas.
Same as you were.
Yes, but he didn't move to Oklahoma until he was about 2 1/2. They didn't go at the opening of the Cherokee land run. They waited and went down there and bought land. And I understand he was 2 1/2 years old. And they was down there very close to where my father staked his claim.
The first claim that was
Yes.
underwater.
Yeah, they farmed around that land later, he and his father, and knew the people that my father had met down there. But I'm so glad they didn't stay. And later,
Let me see. Don't we have a picture of them down there on that in the blackjacks?
They
Don't
call
they
it the
call it
blackjacks.
because of the thing?
yes, that,
Yeah. Doesn't that show them?
yeah. There's Harold and Martin there, but only 2 little boys.
Only 2 boys.
Yeah.
And then Aunt Clara was the oldest of
Yeah.
his sisters,
Yeah.
right?
She and Alice is about the same size there.
And that's Aunt Alice.
Yeah,
Aunt Ethel.
and Florence and Nellie.
And Uncle Martin, of course, was the only brother.
And this was grandfather and his sister and 2 brothers.
Agnes
Right.
and
Agnes and Norman and Raymond.
Yes, all living
All
there with them.
down there.
Yeah. But
So they had a nice big family too, not quite as big as the Provost.
there was 7.
There were
of them.
7 of them and 12 of you.
Yeah. So they had pioneer days also. But Aunt Agnes was a school teacher. She taught their school. But she told her brother, she says, George, these girls don't have a chance down here. She wanted him to move to a better community. And they did. They moved up there around Carmen. And it was at an age when Alice and Clara was quite involved with their little friends. And Alice always kind of regretted they moved. She says, we was somebody down there. And up here in Carmen, we never was. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
Alice was a wonderful teacher, and she had lots of friends that highly regarded
yes.
her in her profession. And
She was a teacher for a long time.
oh yes, I forget how many years. She got an Oscar.
special awards for that.
She got an Oscar, you know, for teaching in the same county longer than any other teacher. Well, she taught the limit, you know. She could have retired long before she did.
And after she retired, she still went on teaching
She
out the
did.
boys' school. At,
Yes, that boys'
Where was
correction
that?
correction
Helena?
school.
Helena?
That's where they put the bad boys, down there in Helena.
I think she really found a challenge there.
But I always was amused at her. She always said there really weren't any bad boys.
I know.
She loved it. She said, they are not bad boys. There isn't any bad boys there. But my brother said, listen, he says there's some boys there that wouldn't stop at anything. And he worried about what might happen to Alice. She didn't regard that at all. They needed counseling. They needed parental closeness. But Merle said there was some kids there was awful daring and had done some real bad things.
Well, because she had faith in them and so forth, they wouldn't harm her, I assume.
Well, those kids were the kind. He was afraid they might know where she lived and do her harm for money or something. But some of them married and had children come back to see her. So she just loved
Now
it.
that's their farm that was not too far from you, right?
5 miles, exactly. Yes, that was their
That's
farm.
where they
Yeah.
lived until, and raised all their kids.
They all grew up there,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why they left the farm was because of the war. Uncle Martin, you know, had to go through the war, and that's when we come back to the farm. We came home for Christmas, and you was a baby, and they all fell in love with you. We couldn't take that baby anywhere and leave. My goodness. And besides that, we need somebody to help us with the farm. Martin's going to have to go in the Army. That was 1914. They knew he was up for the draft. And probably your father wouldn't go because they needed the wheat farmers. And that's what they had, wheat. And they had all that Uncle Martin could do. And they just, all the young men was going, all of them.
Uncle Martin was single, and so
Yes,
that's
but-
why they would take him and not
Right.
my father.
Yes. And your father was married with a child and could farm the wheat land. So they just begged us to stay and help with the farming. Well, what else could you do? You were supposed to be a good soldier. If you helped in any way, we was trying to feed the world, you know that?
Yes.
The world was starving, and we had everything. Well, we had to have tokens to buy so much flour ourselves. We had to buy so much substitute before we could get 10 pounds of flour. Same way with sugar. And we had to substitute cornmeal for flour and all kinds of cereal for food because they needed it overseas. And that's the way we was living. So we went back to the farm for a few years. And Martin come home from the Army, and your father and he farmed 4 farms for quite a while. But your father wasn't too happy at farming. He had other ideas. And so he had some wheels in his head. He wanted to invent some things. And he felt like if he went to town, he could have parts made and things done. So that's what he did. We went to Kansas City finally, and he set up a model shop. He made models for people and grew from that, built his own models and inventions. And then when the 1930 hit us, practically everybody lost everything they had. So people couldn't afford to have their models made, couldn't pay for them if they did. And he made lots of models and never could collect for them. So we was pretty low ebb about that time. But we weathered through it best we could, like a lot of them did. More of them went broke. But that was a real depression, if you ever heard of one. When they talk about the depression now, I just have to laugh. They just don't know anything about a depression. You could have a good farm. You couldn't, if you had a loan on it, you couldn't meet your payments. You couldn't sell it for taxes. You lost it. Hundreds of farmers lost their farms. And that isn't all. 100 businessmen lost the business and lost their jobs. Had been with companies, railroad companies and everything. People just don't know what a depression is when they talk about it.
Yeah, when we were on the farm, it seems like I can remember that we were pretty prosperous for a while. We had that great big team of horses.
Yeah.
And all that.
Well, you see, the war was on, just like all wars. Everything rises in price. Wheat price went up sky high, but if you bought anything, you paid plenty for it. So when the war was over, the bottom fell out, just like that. Here was all these boys coming home to go back to the farm and seek jobs. And so horses that we bought for $500, you do well if you get $250 out of them. So that's the way we closed our farm. We lost a lot of money. But we had several good, prosperous years. But we finally went to town, and he did what he wanted to do, and I think what he thought he could do best. And so I kind of liked the farm, but I was always glad we left. I felt you girls had a better chance at education and everything, and I think you did. I think you did. Because you would just gone to a country school if we lived there for 8 years, and then you'd have to drive into town. But they did it. All of them did it. All the Browns did it. 7 miles to high school. Alice and Harold did. And then the girls went to Tacoma then, got high school, accredited high school there. And they had a little car then, and Nellie was chauffeur. And the three of them would drive to school every morning and home. But that was a far cry from walking 2 or 3 miles.
Exactly.
So you went to school 2 weeks, come down with scarlet fever, then had diphtheria, and if they hadn't come up with a new serum for diphtheria, I don't think you'd been here today. You was a mighty sick girl, but that was new, that diphtheria toxin. And you had to have 2 doses of it.
I remember them. They hurt.
You said they did.
Oh, they hurt.
It's just a
I
terrible.
remember the second time the doctor stayed there.
He did.
And I just begged you to have him go so I could throw another fit. It hurt so bad.
He wanted to stay and to see what your reaction was. And he says, now, tomorrow, if her fever starts up again, you call me immediately. But thank goodness tomorrow came, and you was just like a rag. You couldn't even hardly raise your hand. Your fever had left you, and oh, you was limp, you was sick, but you was hungry, and that was a good sign. And your father and I had just sat up day and night till we were just worn out. But we were so strong and happy that day because you didn't even have to have another shot. And from that time on, you got better. But you was sure a sick gal. That was terrible. Diphtheria and scarlet fever. And you wasn't very strong the rest of the winter. You had pleurisy, and you had croup, you had everything. So that was the next year we moved to Kansas City.
That might have had something to do with it, too.
Might have. I think the interesting thing, too, about your family, your Provo family, is how you've kept in close touch over all the years.
Well, we were a close-knit family. We just always wanted to help each other, and we were like that. And one of my brother-in-laws said he thought it was because there was so many girls that helped to keep the family in touch. But I don't know, we just kept in touch, and then we finally organized this family letter. And that's been going, and still is, still goes around, hits everybody's home that wants to read it and write in it. Nieces and nephews have taken over where their parents left off, and there was 12 of us then. Now there's only 4. 4 out of the 12 left. But nearly every one of those families are represented by one of their children. So
and everybody writes a letter in it, takes out their old one, puts a new in, and sends it around and around, so it never stops.
My Aunt Mary used to get it, and she called it the round robin. And it's just a chain letter is what it is. But we've kept in touch, and we write other letters, make telephone calls, and always have. And I still have my letter, the last letter my father wrote in it, just a month before he was killed on the highway. And when it arrived, we had copies made of it. Everybody wanted it.
How old was he then?
He was 68.
68.
Yes, and that was quite young. He was 68 years old.
Because in the meantime, he'd moved to town.
He left the farm, retired. He wanted to give the 4 youngest a better chance at education. So he moved to Enid, and they were all ready for high school. Maybe 9 it wasn't, junior high maybe. But so he and my stepmother moved into Enid, and he rented the farm. Well, they farmed it, so to speak, the first year or 2, and come out for harvest. And then finally, he rented it to other people. But when he was killed, I believe Wilma and Fred was living on the farm, and that was just about 3.5 miles from where we always lived. And he just loved the harvest. And he wrote me a letter just before harvest. He says, I don't know whether I'll go out to the farm this year for harvest or not. He says, maybe I won't. But he did. He went. And he was just hauling wheat in his truck to the elevator. And he told the elevator boy, so he said he waved at her and he says, one more load and I'm going home. He was going back to Enid. Well, 30 minutes later, he was cruelly hurt. He was hit broadside. And the truck door flew open. He was falling out, and at that speed, it flew back on him and hurt him inwardly. So he only lived a few hours, and they often wondered if he even knew what hit him. I doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Another car struck him at the intersection.
Yes, hit him in the side. He's coming from that way, and it was a blind corner. Trees around that house there, you couldn't see. But that young boy was going for his camera. They was 4th of July, getting ready to go on a picnic, and he left his camera 3 or 4 miles out in the country. So he was rushing out to get it, and probably was traveling at a real high speed. And that old truck Daddy was driving wasn't that speedy, but they just come at the same spot at the same time. Mm-hmm. And that was really sad and sudden, another sudden death.
And in Enid, he had become a businessman.
Yes, he retired, and he became, I believe, stocks and bond and real estate. Mm-hmm. And he was very successful at it at the time he died. Mm-hmm. But that was before the 1930 till he was killed that year. But the Depression hadn't hardly set in yet. And so actually, they lost a lot of his property. Mm-hmm. Lost a lot of it. I said, if he'd been there to manage, it'd been different. Mm-hmm. But nobody had any money to buy a farm mm-hmm. that you was about to lose because you couldn't meet your payments, or town property. Mm-hmm. He had
a lot of property in town.
Yes, he did. But they managed to save the old homestead mm-hmm. for a few years, but they didn't get $100,000 for it, did they?
I expect not.
But
another thing that kept your family together was the reunions.
Yes, that's right. We started spreading out all over the United States, not seeing each other too often. And with Mother and Daddy both gone, they decided this is just too much. We had to find a way to get together. So there at the homestead, my brother Merle and my Uncle Mel organized the first family reunion, 1937. And Uncle Mel belonged to the Masons, and they had what they call Masonic Park. They all had a cabin. He says, I think I can get enough people to rent their cabin that we can have the reunion there. Because in the summer, when they didn't want to be there, they rented these cabins. So it grew to be attendance 100, and probably the most was up here at Bailey, and we had 137, I think. Mm-hmm. And by then, Frank and Mary Leen had